Takeline is brought to you by Underdog Fantasy's Pick'em game. Just pick over or under on your favorite or least favorite player stats, and you can win up to 20 times your money in a single night. Underdog keeps it incredibly simple with their easy-to-use website and mobile apps. Just set it and forget it. Sign up now with the code TAKELINE and you'll double your first deposit up to $100 in bonus cash when you make your first deposit of $10 or more. Deposit $100, get $100 free. Sign up and play today. Friday was a horrible day. I think that's almost an understatement. In American history, the consequences of the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade will be innumerable in the days, months, and years to come. But what we know for sure is that the decision has been met with outrage, disappointment, and immediate resistance from all corners of society, including sports. The avalanche of negative reactions from across the sports spectrum has rung loudly. And here to help us document and discuss the conversation athletes are having around this latest American travesty is Rachel Bachman, senior sports reporter of the Wall Street Journal. Rachel, welcome to Takeline.
Thanks so much for having me, Jordan.
Yay, thanks for being here. I first want to start with your personal account, your story when you learned the verdict on Friday. Where were you? How did you see it? What was your first reaction?
Honestly, I don't exactly remember how I heard it, probably on Twitter, like I hear about most news. But my reaction was similar to a lot of people in that people sort of knew this was coming because of the leak. But it was still stunning to see. I think this is the first time that the Supreme Court has actually taken away a right that it had previously granted. And so that fact alone was pretty shocking, no matter how you come down on the law itself.
And I was thinking about that too, because of the leak. Imagine if we didn't have that and this news just hit out of nowhere. It was a softer blow, but it still hurt. It was terrible.
It was shocking. It was definitely shocking. And it's funny because we did have the leak, and so a lot of people were prepared, but it was still shocking because the reality is always, I guess, a little different from the possibility.
Yeah. And in the sports world, I think a lot of people forget that athletes are humans first, and women's sports athletes, they are women's first. So I know you've been following some of the reactions from a lot of athletes and people in the sports community over the weekend. Some of the biggest names have spoken out. Any comments in particular have stood out to you?
Well, I think the most remarkable statement was from Megan Rapinoe of the U.S. women's national team. And it just so happens that the ruling came down the day before the U.S. women's team had a friendly game already scheduled, and they had a media availability scheduled. Megan Rapinoe was not scheduled to be on that media availability. They just usually make one player who happened not to be her that day and a coach available. And but she chose to speak to the media because she has become, she's been a captain of this team, and she has become, as many people know, very outspoken on a whole range of issues. Mm-hmm. And she was fighting tears as she spoke about it. She called the decision sad and cruel, and what was very emotional about it. And you just look at the statistics of, you look at opinion polls nationwide and so on about this issue. And, generally speaking, younger people tend to favor abortion rights, and women tend to favor abortion rights. And I haven't seen this poll, but I would guess that probably female athletes tend to favor abortion rights above the national average. And so when you combine all of those things, you can draw the conclusion that many, many female athletes were very upset by this decision. And that's what we saw play out in the reactions.
Yeah, that video was so powerful of Megan Rapinoe. It was 9 minutes. She was just talking from the heart, fighting back tears. And it felt like she was talking for all of us. It was really amazing. But on the flip side of that, has anyone's silence kind of surprised you, or anyone not speaking out from leagues or anything else?
Well, we probably shouldn't be surprised by the fact that the fastest and the most outspoken teams and leagues about this were women's teams and leagues. Mm-hmm. So we heard from the National Women's Soccer League, which is the professional league for women's soccer in the U.S. We heard from the WNBA Players Association very quickly. And then the most interesting reaction, I thought, was from the NBA and WNBA, which issued a joint statement. And the NBA arguably has been the most progressive major U.S. men's league in terms of becoming involved in social issues and being outspoken and so on. But it was interesting to me that that league issued a statement in conjunction with its women's equivalent. It's an interesting question whether the NBA, if the WNBA didn't exist, if the NBA would have issued that statement. I don't know. Maybe it would have, but so far I have not seen other major men's leagues make statements on this issue. Maybe I missed it, but about the 24 hours after the decision came down, I didn't see anything from any other major men's professional leagues.
Does that surprise you at all? Or I would hope that all the statements would be overflowing, but what do we need from male athletes and male leagues from this time? Like, this is not the time to ghost us and be silent.
Well, it actually doesn't surprise me very much because even as leagues have become more outspoken on various issues, they also have tended to be outspoken on issues that either their players care intensely about and are very outspoken about. So after George Floyd's killing, we heard from the NFL, which, that league really was not very outspoken about issues of racial justice before that. Some people would say very silent in some ways. And there has been this change and shift in pro leagues to be more outspoken about issues. But at the same time, in particular, the NFL and Major League Baseball have pretty large constituencies of conservative fans. They have for one, they're just very large fan bases. And two, they tend to be older fan bases than, for instance, the NBA or Major League Soccer, for instance. And so those things alone made me fairly unsurprised that they didn't, at least initially, issue statements about this ruling and just stayed out of it.
Right. I know we heard from LeBron James and some other prominent individual male athletes. What do you think if there was a male athlete listening to this right now, what do we kind of need from them to use their platform to help their female athletes kind of talk about this and or show support in any way? What would you think?
Well, obviously, it's an individual decision, right? And since I'm a reporter, not a columnist, it's not my job to advocate for certain things. But, if someone, I think there is a level of empathy here that men could show in that this issue does disproportionately affect women. Right. And that also, one point I want to make is that this issue is often painted as, abortion is completely elective and it only happens when someone's been careless. And I think that's sort of a very, very, very narrow look at things. There's a lot of reasons why women in general and female athletes in particular can't be on certain forms of birth control, can't be on hormonal birth control, or maybe even can't be on birth control at all. There are all sorts of contexts. There are reasons why women who are pregnant, who got pregnant on purpose, but have health challenges or complications, can't carry a pregnancy to term. And so I think those are the things that most upset many women because they fear that they can't make those decisions now. And in particular, women in certain states are going to have a much harder time making those decisions. And so I just wanted to make that point that, this is an issue that arguably affects women much more than men, obviously, but in particular female athletes for whom their bodies are their livelihoods. I don't know if you probably remember, years ago, the great sprinter Sanya Richards-Ross talked in her memoir about how she'd had an abortion. It was a completely agonizing decision. and very difficult, and how sort of that decision and its aftermath really complicated things with her then fiance and husband, partly because he couldn't, at a certain level, he couldn't be involved. And so I think that's just one example of many where women just carry a much heavier burden in this issue. And of course, female athletes in particular. That was right before the 2008 Beijing Olympics. So really awful, terrible position she was in to make before those games.
I immediately thought about her story when thinking about this and how this would, this ruling affects the sports industry. I think a lot of people might not see them connected in any way, but like I said at the top of this, women athletes are women first, and their bodies are what they're getting, they have to be in shape. They have to do all these things, and they're in their prime, and there's so much there's thoughts that have to go on, and that should be their decision when they would love to be a mom or start that process. But I kind of want to talk about that as whole. Like, what other effects does this ruling affect the sports industry? How else is it connected and tied together?
It's hard to articulate that because, of course it affects women because it affects their bodies, and anything that affects women's bodies is going to affect, women's sports. But here's an example of something that I feel like has become a big issue because it's become normalized to talk about. In the 1970s, hardly anyone talked about breast cancer. It was taboo, really, until one of the first women to talk about it was Betty Ford, the President Gerald Ford's wife. And because she had it, and she really was one of the first people to break down the taboo of talking about breast cancer. Now, we know of millions of women who've had it, unfortunately, because that taboo is no longer in existence. And what happens? The NFL has people wearing pink shoes and breast cancer awareness nights and donations and so on. That would not have happened before that taboo was broken. And so this is just a very different situation. I think there's still so much of a taboo about this issue that the general public really doesn't have any broader awareness of how prevalent abortions are. We just, we don't, because people don't talk about them. It's, Sanya Richards-Ross stands out because she's a rarity in having been so honest about it. And so I think that is one challenge of articulating how potentially profound this issue is. I mean, even aside from the choice issue, which is much broader than the number of women who end up having abortions for whatever reason, it is just still such a taboo to talk about that we don't have those broader discussions and those casual, I shouldn't say casual, but those conversations about helping make things better in some way, and so like improving healthcare outcomes, for instance, for everybody, which I think everybody can agree should happen. There should be better healthcare and health support because a lot of the healthcare outcomes in this country are suboptimal for how wealthy a country we are. So it's very difficult to say what the ramifications of this are at this moment, because I don't think we have a sense of how profoundly this issue has already affected women and female athletes because it is taboo. So many of them have dealt with some variation of this issue in silence. And I think that's going to continue as long as this is a taboo.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think Sanya Richards-Ross was incredibly brave to come forward and share her story. But I feel and I hope that other female athletes know that we want to have that empathy. And if they do come forward and share their stories, it's only in support and be able to put a face to this issue. I think a lot of times it is this taboo, very far different, far away thing, unless it becomes your story or a part of someone that you know. Thank you so much for being here and talking us through this. I felt like we were holding hands and going through this together. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jordan. It's really, we really are entering uncharted territory because, really almost every female athlete alive right now has existed in a world of Roe. And so we're now entering, a new era. And so it's very hard to say what that's going to be like.
Well, we're in this together. We got to hold each other up. She is Rachel Bachman, senior sports reporter at the Wall Street Journal. Rachel, thank you again for joining Takeline.
Thanks so much, Jordan. Appreciate your time.